Hello and welcome to India's World. After Turkey shot down a Russian Sukhoi Su-24 military aircraft over Syrian territory, Russian President Vladimir Putin described the event as a stab in the back by the accomplices of terrorists. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called it a planned provocation by Turkey. He told Turkey's foreign minister in a telephone conversation that by shooting down the Russian plane on a counter-terrorist mission, the Turkish government had in effect sided with ISIS, the Islamic State. He alleged that Turkey was buying and shipping oil from ISIS, which is transported through the same area where the Russian plane was shot down. This area, he said, also houses terrorist infrastructure, arms and munition depots, and control centers. While Turkey is a member of NATO, Turkey and Russia are not traditional enemies. In fact, they have deep economic ties. But the two countries find themselves on opposing sides in the Syrian conflict. It is clear that after the Paris terrorist attack and the downing of the Russian aircraft by Turkey, the geopolitics surrounding the Syrian crisis is likely to change significantly. To discuss this and more, we have with us three distinguished experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India. He was India's ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France, and Russia. We have with us Ambassador Ajai Malhotra. He's a former ambassador to Russia. He also represented India at the UN and was also ambassador to Romania and Kuwait. And we have with us Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. He's professor at the Center for West Asian Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. I welcome you, gentlemen, to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. What was the broad intent of Turkey in downing the Russian jet, claiming that it had crossed over into its territory, and by their own admission, that crossing over didn't even last 17 seconds?
Well, Turkey has been very much complicit with the whole rise of ISIS and generally the destabilization of Syria. It is through the Turkish border that everything has happened in terms of support going to these groups, arms, shipments, everything else. And this open border, without this open border, this problem wouldn't have become as acute as it has. Turkey has, right from the start, been very vocal about the removal of Assad. They have territorial ambitions in northern Syria, going back to the colonial period. And they have some people of Turkish origin, Turkmen, who have remained on the Syrian side of the border after Turkey in 1930s captured parts of Syria which were under the mandate of France, given to them by the League of Nations. So there is a historical, territorial aspect, ethnic aspect also to all this. They have been warning Russia when Russia started attacking these areas, not so much the ISIS, but these areas which receive direct support from Turkey, that about airspace violations and everything else. And they've gone ahead and shot down the Russian plane, taking a huge and enormous risk. And Erdogan is totally unapologetic, saying that they will do it again. And they've done it for protection of their sovereignty and their airspace, but also for protecting their brethren. Now, that's a very, very, how should I say, provocative thing to say, that they have the right to shoot down a Russian plane to protect their so-called brethren across the international border in Syria. Yeah. So, but we can develop this thought later. I think Turkey has taken a big risk. But one short point. You said Turkey and Russia are traditional, not traditional, are traditional friends or something like this.
They're not traditional enemies.
But they are traditional enemies. Okay. The whole history of this part of the world is that Russia and Turkey have been traditional enemies. And
modern Russia and modern Turkey?
Well, modern Russia is only 20, 30 years old. And Turkey, under Erdogan, has Ottoman ambitions, an Ottoman Empire, and
okay. So going
Russia
that far back,
yes.
But let me take this question of sovereignty to you, Ambassador Malhotra. How is it that a violation, airspace violation of 17 seconds, when it is against Turkey, requires shooting down of a Russian aircraft, but others are free to violate the sovereignty of Syria and Syrian airspace all the time, including the United States, its allies, and Syria itself?
Well, that's the difference between strong and being weak. Syria would love to defend its airspace, but President Assad doesn't have the capabilities of doing it in the face of those who are striking at targets within Syria. And this whole point about 17 seconds, again, it's not only the issue of radio signals, also you do visual signaling normally, and none of that was done. So that is also, I think, an important point to take note of. And I did notice also that the Turks said at the highest level that at one stage at least, that it was, they did not realize it was a Russian plane when they sought to explain this away. And that too is also really rather incredible as a statement. Then who did you think you were shooting down? I mean, unless you thought it was one of Assad's planes. And to give a little perspective, let's also not forget that the Russian Air Force and the Russian deployment into Syria was linked with the likelihood then of an imminent declaration of a no-fly zone by Turkey and Jordan across Syria. So there are these angles that should not be forgotten when we look at this issue.
Okay. Professor Ramakrishnan, if the shooting down of the Sukhoi 24 was not a hostile act and was purely a defensive act or was a mistake, why didn't Turkey immediately contact Russia either to seek Russian explanation or to explain their action to Russia? Why did it choose to go to NATO?
I think what it wanted some kind of support from its traditional base because the Turkish government thinks that its operation within Syria, with the Turkmen, for example, the support to Jabhat al-Nusra, because much of what Russia was doing in that area, in Latakia and neighboring regions, was, as Ambassador Sibal was mentioning, with the Turkmen and all. That linkage between Turkey and the Turkmen community within Syria, that is under severe stress because of the Russian attacks there. It's not about Raqqa, it's not about ISIS on the eastern side. So Turkey thinks that much of the space within Syria where it has a hold is now under severe stress because of Russian operation. And it wants to make it a bigger issue with NATO because of what was happening in France and the other developments.
Okay, we'll discuss this further, but we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back with you in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the deterioration in Russia-Turkey relations and their impact on the Syrian crisis. Ms. Sibal, do you think that the US-led coalition, along with Turkey, sees Russia undermining their ground operations in Syria against the Assad government? It's not only Turkey which sees Russia undermining this thing, but also the US-led coalition.
Yes, because President Obama has repeatedly said this, and the differences on this issue came out in the open when the two met recently. In fact, the Americans and even some Europeans had been saying that Russia is attacking the so-called moderate groups and not focusing on ISIL. Now, these moderate groups is a question of vocabulary, but Jabhat al-Nusra and all which were mentioned, they are linked to Al-Qaeda
affiliate.
And all these groups are interlinked. But it suits the West to call them moderate because they are doing the West job, they think, in terms of toppling Assad, whereas ISIL is involved now in global terrorism and they see ISIL as their enemy. But Russia's main objective is to prevent the collapse of the Assad government, and therefore it has given priority to those groups which are focused on this with the help of Turkey and the West. And clearly, on this, there is still differences, except that after the terrorist attack in France, now President Holland has started saying openly that they have to make common cause with Russia and bring them into a coalition to fight against ISIL and give some reprieve to the Assad government, including, as the foreign minister of France, Fabius, said, that there should be 3 groups now fighting ISIL, the West, of course, and the moderate groups, and the troops of President Assad.
Yeah. So let me take the Paris tragedy to Ambassador Malhotra. How much of a setback was the Paris tragedy to Western efforts in Syria? Do you think that this has impacted what some observers called Washington's unstated aim of involving NATO as a force in Syria?
Uh, it is a tragedy, first of all. But in one sense, it might bring countries a little closer together. I think France and Russia is one example.
But NATO together now will not go into, a US-led alliance may go, but NATO will not go into Syria.
Which is probably better, if you ask me. And to step back a minute, I would like to just clarify one or two points. It isn't as if Russia and Turkey have always been enemies. If you recall, when the sanctions were put on Russia, Turkey did not join them. And last year, in December, President Putin paid a rather well-publicized visit to Turkey. So, despite it being a NATO country, and there was talk then of the Turkish Stream project, which hasn't gone very far, nuclear power plant being constructed, etc. So, if you see, there's much in common that can also be there. If you look at this issue and you see where it's coming from, really, it is linked with oil. And I think we need to understand that better. Because if you see also the visuals of much of the bombings carried out, if you see Hama homes and to the right of that area, extending, if you draw a line from Damascus to Latakia, which is a line that they're trying to preserve for Assad's forces, much of the bombing has been of tankers, etc., carrying oil. And I can see where that issue is coming from. I think you alluded to it when you opened our discussion.
We're going to discuss that further in a bit. But let me just carry on with what we were discussing. So, Professor Ramakrishnan, was the attack on the Russian aircraft meant to provoke immediate military retaliation from Russia? And had Russia fallen into that trap, then this would have helped seduce NATO into Syria, because under Article 5, all the NATO countries would be obliged to defend Syria. And do you think Russia did a wise thing by not falling into that trap?
I think Russia did the right thing, because the Turkish involvement in Syria was a mess. So what it initially wanted, it thought that the things would be over quite soon, but it did not happen. And it really wanted NATO to be involved so that it does not take the whole shock on its own and protect its interests, which we have mentioned earlier. But Russia did not fall into that trap. And therefore, the opportunities for some kind of combined action is still open. Yep. And I think that that's a smart move by Russia.
You know, I would like to comment on this a little bit. One, that already the Western countries have distanced themselves from this problem and treating it as essentially a Russia-Turkish problem. Even Obama has called upon the two countries not to escalate matters further and deal with this issue bilaterally. France is very clear. Germany has already indicated it is going to stand out. I don't think there's any possibility of any NATO intervention. Okay. But Russia has been humiliated, and Russia has to somehow strike back. How they strike back, at what time, that remains to be seen.
So you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. I think if there was a hope that Russia might strike back, they've acted with great restraint, and I think rather wisely. They've tried to put economic, give an economic response. And that is a sensible way to proceed. At this moment, you need wisdom.
So the Turkish act was not that strategic in retrospect, because
it'll get contained into Russia-Turkey relations, as was mentioned, and I think that's the right way to go ahead.
But they have not been able to prevent the coming together of US, Britain, France on one side, and the 4+1, that is Russia, Syria, Iran,
Iraq. They have actually suffered two severe setbacks. Yeah. One is that, in effect, whereas Syria wanted to create a no-fly zone, is the Russians now have created a no-fly zone right across Syria by moving their S-400 right up to Latakia, which means that no Syrian plane can make any no Turkish plane can make any threatening move in Syrian airspace. So, in fact, the whole thing has been reversed. Secondly, the Turkish support for ISIL, all these oil flows and everything else, has now become a common discourse of very senior Western politicians. Yeah. So Turkey has, in fact, suffered a great deal in this image by actually now being targeted as the principal supporter of ISIL.
Do you want to add something to this?
And apart from that, the Russian economic kind of blockade, that the military and the economic thing and the supply of goods, etc., that kind of thing also would impact Turkish economy. So it's not only a political kind of
they
issue.
they get a hell of a lot of tourism from Russia. All that will go now.
Yes.
No, it's tourism, it's construction. The Turkish industry business are very prominent in construction across Russia, and agricultural produce, and many other things. So the trade is $30 billion. It's also investment.
Yeah.
There's significant Turkish investment into Russia and also Russian into.
So it's a major
Turkey.
mistake by Russia, by Turkey.
I wouldn't say it's a major mistake, but it is a mistake. And I think things will gradually move towards a more normal situation. Nobody wants to see greater divisions in that part of the world, which is already suffering enough.
All right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the deterioration in Russia-Turkey relations and the impact on the Syrian crisis. Ambassador Sibal, you wanted to say something.
I was saying that Turkey has received a big jolt in terms of its relationship with Europe. Not that they were going to become members of the European Union in any foreseeable future, but I think now there is a great wave of anger and resentment against Turkey and its open support for ISIL. And that, in fact, makes the possibility of stronger Turkey-European Union relations even more difficult in the future. And there could be repercussions down the line. For example, Turkey wants a free visa regime with Europe. There's no question after this that they will they'll ever get this. So Turkey has, in fact, isolated itself by taking this action and actually challenging Russia. As a NATO member, is challenging Russia when for the last 30, 40, 50 years, there's been no such incident where actually a Russian military plane or a military asset has been targeted by a NATO member. So I just can't understand what Erdogan had in his mind when he actually took on this Russia as an adversary in Syria.
Well, he still hasn't realized that he's done something wrong. He wants a face-to-face meeting, sort of a staring match with Putin.
He's too arrogant.
Yeah. Sorry.
There are unsubstantiated reports in the media, at least, about his son maybe being
I wanted
involved
to
in
ask you
something
that
like
question.
that.
So let me ask you that. Let me formulate it like this. So do you think Turkey is breaching all existing laws of preventing funding to terrorism by helping in smuggling oil, which the ISIS is stealing from that region? And some very high-ups in the Syrian establishment are alleged to be profiteering from it because they run transportation companies which are transporting this oil.
Well, one thing is abundantly clear. If that oil is being sold, where is it going? It's not going to Iraq. They have oil. It's not going to Syria, to the Assad government. They won't be doing that.
It's going to East
It's not going to
Asia.
Israel. It's going through Turkey wherever
To
it's
East
going.
Asia.
Yeah, wherever it's going, but it's going via Turkey. How is it going? It's going by these convoys of these tankers, oil tankers. You rightly pointed out, somebody owns those tankers. I think part of the pressure that came in is when the Russians started bombing those tanker parks, etc. There might have been a feeling that you need to do something to kind of control this or to show that this situation can continue from the Turkish viewpoint. It is unfortunate, if you ask me, because I think everyone needs to rally around and put a full stop to IS.
But the head of a state cannot be acting to protect the interests of people close to him by downing a Russian plane. I mean,
you see, it can be explained away by saying that they are under standing instructions that if anyone violates our airspace, we shoot it down. Head of state did not directly give her instructions. So
do
that is a way of getting away.
Are in conflict, or on the verge of a conflict, or are declared adversaries, then you shoot down planes, especially military planes. But when the two countries are friends and have a very important relationship spanning economics, culture, language, everything else, you don't do this, whatever the nature of differences. And in this case, as has been rightly said, the Russian plane was not threatening Syria. And if it was only 17 seconds in Syrian airspace, in Turkish airspace, and then heading towards the Syrian airspace, there was absolutely no threat to Turkey. So why shoot down the plane?
Yeah, let me ask you something related to this. President Putin has said that the flight path and the flight plans of this aircraft was shared with America. And he said we shared it with the US so that it would share it with its allies.
Right.
So they were not doing anything secretively. And his suggestion is that US shared it with Turkey, and Turkey deliberately targeted this aircraft. So doesn't that make the US complicit in this?
When the Russians started the whole operation over Syria, there was a sharing of information with NATO, because that was the understanding at that point of time. Because everybody is involved, there can be accidents and there can be other kinds of things. So I think they're all, they know what's happening around, and the Americans should be knowing about it.
Well, knowing is not complicit, but I'm saying if they shared the plans, the flight path with Turkey, then they should be saying something to Turkey instead of telling Russia that you're complicating the situation. When the US itself has done things which has resulted in the situation in Syria.
But the Americans are not in a position to press on that matter with Russia, because they want some kind of cooperation at this moment.
Okay. Now let me ask you something slightly different. Why does Turkey and why does the US want to plant a Sunni regime in Damascus? How would it help them? And does Turkey stand to gain immediately because they have a plan for a gas pipeline from Qatar?
Yes. You see, Iran is a very, very important factor in all this. And the expansion of Iranian power in this region and the so-called Shia axis going through Iraq, Syria, and on to Hezbollah and Lebanon. This is something which is extremely worrying to Israel, to sections of the US political establishment, and of course the Gulf states. And therefore the fall of Assad was necessary in order to prevent the expansion of Iranian power. Now added to that is the neo-Ottoman ambitions of Erdogan and Turkey's special interests in Syria, and to see Assad go. And Turkey's present government is very linked to Muslim Brotherhood, and they associate themselves with those ideas. So therefore they are, you're absolutely right, thinking of a Sunni leadership in Syria, so that they can become the most important prominent player in Syria. And then, as you rightly said, the larger game is to have a pipeline from Qatar through Syria onto Turkey and then to Europe, and from which Turkey will derive immense gains. So it's a very complicated geopolitical game that is being played out. Okay,
last question. We have very little time. What will be the impact of what Turkey has done on the Vienna process for dealing with the Syrian crisis, on the demand that Assad must go, which was a non-negotiable demand up to now, and this business of trying to establish a no-fly zone? Do all of them go for a toss?
No, I won't say so, because the Vienna process, you have no choice. Ultimately, you have to come to the table. Over so many years, you've seen, more than 4 years now, that through force you won't find a solution to what's happening up there. And now with the Russian Air Forces providing air cover to the Assad government, it is not going to be so easy to upturn the government unless there's some unexpected assassination or something like that. So I think ultimately everyone will come back to the table, because that's the right way to proceed. And that's the direction things will take. As regards the other points you made, for Russia at least, they made it very clear that they're not bound to Assad. They want to find a kind of rational and carefully calibrated manner by which they can move on and have a government which is acceptable to everyone. But that also has to be through some process, either which is negotiated or through elections ultimately. So that has to be seen. But that all lies ahead. It's, we are still far away from that moment. This is a complication, but it won't last forever. I see it receding fairly soon.
All right. On that happy note, we've really run out of time. So I'd like to thank Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, Ambassador Ajai Malhotra, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal for coming here and participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again as usual next week. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.